Welcome back to the show. Today's deep dive is a little bit different. We're going full-on true crime mystery today. Um, we're going to unpack a case that really kind of sits at the intersection of music and murder and technology, and I think it'll make you think. It's a fascinating case. Have you ever heard of the rapper Skinny Me?
The name rings a bell, but to be honest, it's been a while. Remind me who we're dealing with here.
Skinny Me was the stage name of a guy named Abbas Parker, a Philadelphia rapper. And he was actually convicted of murder back in 2019. And the reason this case is so fascinating is because his music, specifically his rap lyrics, ended up being a big part of the investigation. We're talking court documents, digital trails, you name it. You ready to kind of get into it?
I'm ready. Let's do it. Lay it on me. Who was the victim and what were the circumstances of the murder?
Okay, so it's September 11, 2017. It's evening in Philadelphia. And our victim, Sherman Williams, who was also a rapper, he's riding his scooter, and he gets gunned down. They said it was 6 shots, close range, fatal.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that sounds like more than just a random act of violence. Was there any connection between Parker and Williams?
Well, they did know each other. And actually, some of Williams' Instagram posts included what you might call rap disses directed at Parker. And police actually found screenshots of these posts on Parker's cell phone, which, as you can imagine, ended up being a key piece of evidence in the case.
The digital age strikes again. Our phones really are extensions of ourselves. And in this case, maybe not in a good way, right? What else did they find on his phone?
Okay, so this is kind of interesting. It's almost like Parker created a digital breadcrumb trail leading right to him without realizing it. So the police found a photo of Williams standing outside his house, which Parker had saved on his phone just days before the murder. And they also found, and this is really interesting, a screenshot from Redfin, the real estate website, of Williams' house.
Oh, wow. That's chilling. I mean, that certainly seems to suggest that there was some premeditation, a targeted plan.
I know, right? And here's where it gets even more interesting. So after the murder, Parker releases 2 rap videos. One is called Bloodis, and the other is Notorious. And if you remember those Instagram rap disses that Williams posted, well, the lyrics in Bloodis actually seem to respond to those disses. And some of the lines are eerily similar to details from the murder.
Wait a minute. So you're saying the rap lyrics themselves were considered evidence? That's kind of crossing into a legally and ethically gray area, isn't it? How much weight did the lyrics actually have in the investigation?
A lot, as it turned out. So let me give you an example. In Bloodos, Parker raps, "Broad day I shoot, yeah, I take ya head Medusa."
Yeah.
Remember, the shooting happened in broad daylight. And Williams had dreadlocks.
Who cares? Yeah, I see the connection. But I mean,
Yeah.
Couldn't you argue that it's just like typical rap bravado, a stylized threat, not necessarily a confession?
You could.
Yeah.
But that's where the specificity of the details becomes really important. So in another line, he mentions his accomplice. He calls him Moss. Well, it turns out that Malik West, who was with Parker after the murder, his street name is Moss.
Okay, that's a little harder to dismiss as just a coincidence. It seems like it's more than just artistic expression at that point.
Right. And it goes even further. In the song, Parker boasts about an unsolved murder. And that aligns perfectly with the time frame of Williams' death. And then there's another line where he raps about using hollow point ammunition and shooting at close range. And guess what? Those details match the murder weapon and the witness testimony.
Wow, those are some pretty striking parallels. So you've got the cell phone data and the lyrics from Blood Ooze that built the case against Parker. You mentioned a second video earlier, Notorious. How did that one play into the investigation?
Yeah, Notorious is interesting because while the lyrics weren't used as evidence, the video itself actually became a very significant piece of the puzzle. We'll get into exactly why in a little bit, but first, let's talk about the eyewitness.
Yeah, there's someone who actually saw this shooting. Right. Tell me about them.
So the eyewitness, the guy who plays Parker at the scene of the crime, his name was Gregory Alston. And he described seeing Parker standing over Williams during the shooting, which is a pretty chilling detail, and it added a lot of weight to the prosecution's case.
Eyewitness testimony, I mean, that can be very powerful. But it's not always perfect, right? Was there anything about Alston's testimony, his account, that raised any questions?
There was one detail that I thought was particularly interesting. According to the court documents, Alston initially hesitated to positively identify Parker as the shooter.
He hesitated. Interesting. Was he just unsure about what he saw, what was going on there?
There definitely seemed to be some doubt in his mind. And here's where things get really interesting. So according to the court documents, Alston only really solidified his identification of Parker after the investigators showed him the notorious music video.
Wait a minute. Notorious. That's the one where you said the lyrics weren't even considered relevant? What was it about that video that swayed the eyewitness?
It's a question that makes you think about the power of visual imagery and the way it can shape memories. To really understand it, we need to dive into exactly what Alston saw in that video. And for that, we're going to move on to part 2 of our deep dive.
All right, so the notorious video, you were saying it ended up influencing the eyewitness's testimony, even though the lyrics themselves weren't about the murder. How'd that happen?
So this is where the story gets really, really fascinating. Remember we talked about the evidence the police had already found linking Parker to the crime, right? We had the cell phone data and the lyrics from Blood Ooze. But Alston's testimony, him being the eyewitness, that was crucial. They really needed him to place Parker at the scene of the murder.
Right, and he was initially hesitant to identify Parker. So what was it about that notorious video? What did he see that changed his mind?
Well, the court documents, they describe how the video shows Parker rapping and, moving around in a way that was really distinctive, like his gait, his posture, even some specific hand gestures. And those mannerisms, they matched the description that Alston had given of the shooter.
Hold on, so even though Notorious wasn't about the murder, the way Parker was moving in the video somehow backed up what the eyewitness remembered.
That's exactly what happened. It's almost as if Parker accidentally created a visual self-portrait of the suspect, even though he wasn't trying to. The prosecution used the video to basically strengthen Alston's identification. They argued that the video helped him solidify his memory of who the shooter was.
Man, that's wild. That really raises some questions, about memory and perception and how much visual media can affect that. I mean, could it be that seeing Parker in that video, rapping about violence, acting like a tough guy, did that subconsciously influence how Alston remembered what happened?
I think it's definitely possible. We know that eyewitness testimony can be tricky. Memory is a fragile thing, especially in high-stress situations, like when you witness a violent crime.
For sure. There's a whole field of study, on the psychology of eyewitness testimony. And the research is pretty clear. Our memories aren't like perfect video recordings. They can be influenced by so many things. Stress, bias, even being exposed to new information after the fact. Like, for example, watching a music video of the suspect.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what makes this case so complicated. You have this mix of digital evidence, rap lyrics, and eyewitness testimony that might have been swayed, at least a little bit, by the defendant's own art. It really makes you think.
It really does. And this case, it brings up the challenges that the justice system faces in this digital age. Everywhere we go, we're leaving these digital footprints. And those pieces of ourselves can be used in ways that we never even thought of.
Yeah, it's like a double-edged sword. Technology gives us all these ways to express ourselves, connect with people, but it also creates this permanent record. And that record can be analyzed, scrutinized, and potentially used against us.
Exactly. And this case is a perfect example of that. It brings up some really tough questions, like how do we balance free expression with holding people responsible for what they do? Where do we draw the line between art as a creative outlet and art as evidence?
Those are the kinds of questions that legal experts and ethicists have been wrestling with for years, and there are no easy answers. But this case really highlights how important it is to keep talking about this, to understand the complexities and potential problems of using digital evidence, especially when it comes to art.
I totally agree. And it's not just about the legal stuff. It's about society as a whole. If artists are always worried that their lyrics or performances will be seen as confessions, that could have a chilling effect on creativity.
Exactly. Imagine a world where artists are too scared to explore dark themes or controversial ideas or push the boundaries. That would really stifle innovation and limit the power of art. The art's power to challenge and provoke and inspire.
Absolutely. Art has always been about reflecting the human experience, good and bad. And while we definitely need to hold people accountable for their actions, we also need to protect spaces for creative expression, even when it makes us uncomfortable.
So what now? How do we navigate this complicated world where art and technology and the law all overlap?
Well, I think the first thing is awareness. Artists need to think about their digital footprint and the potential consequences of what they put out there. Law enforcement needs to be really careful about interpreting art as evidence. And we, as a society, we need to have open and honest conversations about this, about how art, technology, and justice all relate to each other.
Well put. This case has definitely given us a lot to think about. Abbas Parker, aka Skinny Me. It's such a fascinating story. It shows us how art and technology and law can come together in ways that are really unexpected and sometimes unsettling.
It makes us question our ideas about creativity and evidence, and even about what justice really means. It asks us, how do we protect artistic freedom while still holding people accountable? How do we make sure that our pursuit of justice is fair and balanced and based on solid evidence?
Those are questions that we as a society need to keep wrestling with. We encourage you to keep thinking critically about this, to keep asking those tough questions and engaging in these important discussions.
Yeah.
But you know what? There's one more thing I want to talk about before we wrap up this deep dive. It adds another layer of complexity to this whole case and really makes you question how reliable eyewitness testimony can be. We've talked about the digital trail, the lyrics, the eyewitness, and that notorious video. But there's one more piece of this puzzle, something that makes this case even more complicated.
Oh, really? I'm all ears. What is it?
It all goes back to Gregory Alston, the eyewitness. Remember, he wasn't sure about Parker at first and only really made up his mind after seeing the notorious video. Well, the court documents, they tell us a bit more of the story.
Okay, what do the documents say? What else was going on?
So it turns out that Alston didn't just see the video. The investigators, they also showed him a photo array, with Parker's picture and a few other guys.
Right, that's pretty standard, isn't it? You want to make sure the witness isn't swayed by only seeing one suspect, to avoid misidentification.
Exactly. But here's the thing. The documents say that when Alston first looked at those photos, he wasn't 100% certain. He kind of pointed at Parker's picture, but he said he couldn't be totally sure that was the shooter.
So even with the photo array, there was still some doubt in his mind. It makes you wonder what really convinced him in the end. Was it the video, or was it something else entirely?
That's the big question, right? We can't get inside Alston's head and know for sure. But it does raise some big questions about eyewitness testimony, how reliable it really is.
Yeah, absolutely. This whole case, it's like a textbook example of how complex and unreliable eyewitness testimony can be. Even with safeguards like the photo array, there's always the possibility of bias or suggestion. And you have to factor in how our memories work or don't work sometimes.
It really is a lot to think about.
Yeah.
Here we have a conviction that's based, at least in part, on an eyewitness who was influenced to some extent by the defendant's art. It blurs the lines between art, perception, and justice.
Definitely does. It shows how important it is to be really careful with all the evidence, especially when it comes to art, which is always open to interpretation.
In this case, it really makes me think about how important it is to do more research and make changes to how we handle eyewitness identification. We have to find ways to make those accounts more accurate, to reduce the risk of someone being wrongly convicted.
I couldn't agree more. This case reminds us that the justice system, while it aims to be fair, it's still run by humans. It can have the same weaknesses and biases as anything else. It needs to keep evolving and finding ways to be better.
Really well said. To everyone listening, we hope this deep dive has given you food for thought. The case of Abbas Parker, Skinny Me, it's fascinating, complicated, and it shows just how much art, technology, and the law are all intertwined.
It definitely makes you rethink your ideas about creativity, evidence, and what justice is. It pushes us to ask those tough questions. How do we protect artistic freedom while also making sure people are responsible for their actions? How do we ensure that our pursuit of justice is fair, balanced, and based on solid evidence?
Add questions to ponder. We encourage you to think critically about all of this. Keep those questions coming and keep having those important conversations.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another one. Until then, stay curious. All right, so get ready, because today we are going deep, really deep, into the life of Stanley Tookie Williams.
Tookie Williams, yeah.
Now, some of you might recognize the name as the co-founder of the Crips.
One of, if not the most notorious gang in the U.S.
But, and this is what makes this story so fascinating, he went from a life completely immersed in violence to becoming a, get this, Nobel Peace Prize nominee.
It's incredible.
We're going to be dissecting excerpts from his Wikipedia page to unpack, to try and understand how that shift happened.
How does someone go from, founding a gang like the Crips to being nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize?
Yeah.
It's truly a story that begs the question, can people change? What is human nature all about? And you're right, we're not here to to glorify gang life or to condemn anybody.
Right.
We're just here to explore this one individual and what made him tick.
Yeah, and, to kind of understand the forces that shaped him,
Exactly.
the choices that he made.
The choices he made and the legacy that he ultimately left behind.
So let's start at the beginning. Williams was born in Shreveport, Louisiana,
Right.
but his story really begins in South Central LA.
Right.
And it's there that he moves as a child. So imagine a place where street fights, even dog fights, were just commonplace.
Wow.
And a young Williams, he quickly gets this reputation for being a pretty good fighter himself.
Really. So this environment really shapes him. This lack of structure, right? The exposure to violence, this need to prove himself, to be tough, to survive it all, becomes very deeply ingrained in him.
And it's in this context that the Crips emerge.
Right.
Now, here's where things get really interesting. Williams, actually, he despised those youth gangs
He did.
that were popping up at the time. He viewed them as predators, exploiting the weak.
Wow.
He co-founds the Crips.
He does.
He intended to create a force, like he said, to protect the community. But the irony is that it spiraled into the very monster that he initially sought to combat.
Oh, the irony. It's like, you set out to do something good and it just takes on a life of its own.
Yeah.
So how does someone go from, absolutely despising these gangs to actually being a leader of one?
So how does he go from loathing gangs to leading one? I mean, we know he was physically imposing thanks to his weightlifting. He had that reputation for violence.
Right.
And then he makes that really critical alliance with Raymond Washington, another powerful figure at the time.
Yeah.
But is there something more at play here?
Well, think about how volatile the landscape of gang leadership was at the time.
Okay.
A lot of the early Crips leaders, they met very violent ends or they ended up incarcerated.
Oh, wow.
And this constant churn that really solidified Williams' position. It pushed him to the top.
Yeah.
In a very brutal, unforgiving world.
And for a time, he led this really strange double life.
Oh.
He was working as an anti-gang youth counselor,
What?
while simultaneously he was this powerful gang leader.
Wow, it's almost like he was trying to make amends, to atone for his actions while still kind of participating in the system.
Yeah.
This duality couldn't last forever, though.
Right.
He ends up getting wounded in a drive-by shooting.
Oh, wow.
He suffers the loss of his grandmother. He loses his job,
Oh, no.
and he kind of spirals
Spirals.
into PCP use. And this downward spiral, that culminates in the 1979 murders,
Right.
the events that would lead to his death sentence.
The source material, it details these events, 2 robberies,
Okay.
and then the murders of Albert Owens, Yen Ye Yang, Sai Shai Si Yang, and Yu Chin Yang Lin.
Well.
And it lays it out in a very straightforward manner.
Okay.
And Williams, though, he always maintained his innocence.
He did.
But the physical evidence, specifically his shotgun, tied him to those crime scenes.
And that becomes the key thing, right? The crux of the case against him. But his story doesn't just end there.
No.
Over the years, there were tons of appeals.
Yeah.
And they focused on things like potential racial bias in jury selection
Yeah, that's a big one.
and how the evidence was handled.
Right.
Now, on top of all that, there was his anti-gang activism from prison
Right.
and then his multiple Nobel Peace Prize nominations. That really complicated the narrative.
It's almost like 2 separate stories converging.
It is.
You have the convicted murderer,
Right.
and then this figure who's advocating against gang violence, appealing to people's sense of hope and redemption. It's really no wonder that this case attracted so much attention.
It captured the public's imagination.
Yeah.
And it fueled this massive clemency campaign.
Yeah.
This wasn't just a legal battle anymore.
Yeah.
It was a moral and philosophical debate
Right.
about the possibility of transformation, whether someone so deeply involved in violence could genuinely change.
And at the center of all of it was Governor Schwarzenegger holding Williams' fate in his hands.
Yeah, and despite those pleas for clemency, despite the arguments made during the appeals, Schwarzenegger ultimately denied it.
He did.
He did. And his decision hinged on what he perceived as a lack of genuine remorse from Williams,
Yeah.
like a missing piece of the puzzle of redemption.
So in 2005, Stanley Tookie Williams was executed.
Wow.
Witnesses described a really somber atmosphere.
Yeah.
His supporters, they offered Black Power salutes.
Interesting.
It's a stark contrast to the gravity of the situation.
Absolutely.
And then this outburst. The state of California just killed an innocent man.
Wow.
It pierces the silence.
It's a moment that really underscored the profound divisions that surrounded this case. Even in death, Williams remained a polarizing figure. a symbol of both hope and despair, leaving behind a legacy, really open to interpretation. But before we delve into those reactions and kind of unpack the complexities of his legacy, what are your initial sense? What are your first impressions? What aspects of this first chapter of Tookie's story stand out to you?
It's a lot to process. But that juxtaposition of his violent past with his later activism is jarring. And that question of whether he truly changed or was simply a master manipulator, it lingers.
It does, and those are questions that we'll continue to explore as we dive deeper into the final chapters of Stanley Tookie Williams' life.
You know, it's interesting you bring up manipulation because that seemed to be a recurring theme throughout the appeals process and the clemency debate.
Yeah.
Some people argued that his anti-gang work was calculated, like a move to just escape execution,
Right.
while others saw it as genuine evidence of change. So how do we really determine, what constitutes a sincere apology or transformation, especially within the justice system?
Right.
If he had unequivocally apologized for those murders, would it have changed Schwarzenegger's decision? Or was there just something deeper, like maybe a belief that certain actions are just simply unforgivable?
It's a really good point. Schwarzenegger was pretty adamant about the lack of apology being a major factor.
Right.
But were there other considerations too, like the arguments about racial bias in jury selection?
Right, like 3 Black people were removed from that jury pool,
Exactly.
which raises some serious questions about whether he received a fair trial.
And you can't ignore the social and political climate of that era.
Right.
We're talking about Los Angeles just a few years after the Rodney King riots, a time of such heightened racial tension.
Right.
In that context, it inevitably influenced the perception of the case and potentially even the legal proceedings.
And then there were those arguments about the evidence itself.
Oh, brief.
Williams's lawyers contested the methods used by that prosecution's firearms expert,
Okay.
suggesting that the link between Williams and the murders might have been a little bit weaker than it was presented.
So that's a key point. If that evidence connecting him to those murders was questionable, then it really casts doubt on the entire case.
Exactly. And then you add in the allegations of jailhouse informants being used to bolster the prosecution's case. If that's true, that's a pretty significant ethical breach.
Yeah, jailhouse informants are notoriously unreliable, often motivated by their own self-interest. It really makes you question the information used to convict him.
Were they telling the truth? Were they just trying to cut deals for themselves? It's a really disturbing possibility that further muddies the waters. It's like each layer we peel back reveals another layer of complexity. It's not just about Williams's guilt or innocence.
It's not.
It's about the flaws within the system itself, the potential for bias, the pressure to get those convictions, and the ethical lines that sometimes get blurred.
Williams's story becomes a microcosm of these larger societal issues.
Yeah.
The racism, the flaws within the criminal justice system, the yearning for redemption, and this question of whether our past actions should forever define us.
And that's what makes this deep dive so compelling.
Right.
It's not just a historical recounting, it's a reflection of ourselves,
Absolutely.
our values, the difficult questions that we grapple with as a society. But before we get too philosophical, let's go back to Williams's activism for a second.
Okay.
He wrote several children's books.
He did.
To try to steer kids away from gang life.
He did, yeah. And
Yeah.
they were actually really successful.
They were.
They were distributed in schools and used by anti-gang programs.
Wow.
It seemed like he was really trying to make amends for the path that he had chosen and the harm that he had caused.
But didn't he face criticism for that too?
He did, yeah.
People questioning his motives? Saying he was still connected to the Crips, even maybe profiting off of his notoriety.
There was definitely pushback. Law enforcement officials questioned his sincerity, especially since he refused to inform on other gang members.
Oh, wow.
It's like he was caught between two worlds,
Yeah.
trying to distance himself from that past, but still adhering to this code of silence. It seems like every step forward he was met with skepticism and resistance. So how do we reconcile these seemingly contradictory aspects of his life? The violence, the activism, the unwavering loyalty to the gang code, even while advocating against gang life.
Right.
That's the question, isn't it? Can someone truly transform? Are they forever shaped by their past? It's a question that really goes beyond Tookie Williams and makes us examine our own beliefs about redemption, forgiveness, second chances.
It makes you wonder if there's a point, where someone has done enough to really prove that they've changed, or are some actions just too grave to forgive?
That's a big question.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's an easy answer. I mean, it really gets to the core of what we value as a society, how we define justice. Do we prioritize punishment or rehabilitation, retribution or forgiveness?
These are heavy concepts to wrestle with.
They are.
And they're made even more complex when you consider that this isn't some abstract philosophical debate. This is a man's life
Yeah.
hanging in the balance. And in the end, the scales tipped against him.
And that brings us to the final chapter, the execution itself and the aftermath that continues to kind of ripple through society, even today. Before we dive into that, though, is there anything that's particularly struck you about this middle phase of his life?
I think what stands out to me is this constant push and pull between hope and despair.
Yeah.
On one hand, you have this man seemingly trying to make amends, and on the other, you have these lingering doubts.
Yeah.
About his sincerity. It's like a constant battle between who he was and who he was trying to become.
Yeah, it's a story filled with contradictions, and you know, that final chapter is just as impactful.
It is. It really is. I mean, this case attracted global attention. Think about figures like Snoop Dogg and Jamie Foxx. I mean, they were pleading for clemency. That speaks volumes about the level of fascination with this case and the debate surrounding Williams.
It was a media frenzy, and for good reason, right? It wasn't just about a legal outcome. It became a referendum on this very concept of redemption. Could society accept that someone who'd committed these heinous acts could truly change?
Right. And in the end, Schwarzenegger said no.
He did. And what were the reactions to that decision? I mean, outrage. Outrage mostly from Williams's supporters. They felt like his transformation had been ignored. And the chance for, you know, a really powerful message of redemption was lost.
Yeah. His execution must have been incredibly tense. What was the atmosphere like?
It was somber. You know, witnesses said that Williams himself was calm. He didn't offer any resistance. But there was this definite undercurrent of tension. You know, this wasn't just another execution. It was a culmination of years of legal battles and moral debates and fervent activism.
And then right at the end, that outburst from someone in the crowd, the state of California just killed an innocent man. It's chilling even now.
It was a stark reminder of how deeply divided people were, how divided opinions were about this case. Even in death, Williams remained this figure of controversy.
So he's gone, but the story doesn't just end there. What happened after the execution?
Well, there was a massive funeral in L.A., attended by thousands of mourners. I mean, you had this mix of gang members, celebrities, religious leaders, and then just everyday people. It was a really unique gathering.
Wow.
I mean, it reflected, you know, the many different facets of Williams's life and the impact that he had on so many.
And Snoop Dogg recited a poem,
Right.
a reflection on Williams's life and what he represented.
He did. It was a really poignant moment. The poem, it acknowledged the darkness of Williams's past, but also emphasized the hope that his transformation offered.
Right.
It really encapsulated that struggle between judgment and forgiveness that so many people grappled with.
It's amazing how this case, which originated in California, had these repercussions, you know, worldwide. Didn't Schwarzenegger even face backlash in his native Austria?
He did, yeah. There were calls to strip him of his Austrian citizenship.
Really?
He ended up cutting ties with his hometown of Graz, demanding his name be removed from a stadium there.
Yeah.
It's crazy. It shows how deeply this case resonated with people around the world.
A local case with global implications. It speaks to the power of this story. Even now, years after his death, we're still talking about Tookie Williams.
Exactly. His life, it raises these really enduring questions about crime and punishment, about, you know, the possibilities and the limits of redemption, and about the role of race in our justice system. It forces us to confront, you know, some uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our society.
And you mentioned that his children's books were actually quite successful. Are those still available today?
They are. And they're still used as a tool to deter kids from gang life. It's almost like a part of Williams' legacy that lives on, a testament to his desire to make amends for his past.
It's pretty remarkable that even after everything, a part of him is still working towards the good. So here we are, years after his death, still grappling with the complexities of Tookie Williams.
We are. Was he a truly reformed man? Was he a manipulator? Was he a victim of circumstance? I think the answer lies somewhere in between. In those gray areas, you know, those gray areas that make us uncomfortable, but also force us to think critically and challenge our assumptions.
It's a story that forces us to confront, you know, the very nature of good and evil, the potential for change, and the often imperfect nature of justice.
I think the best we can do is approach this story and others like it, with a willingness to learn, to question, and to acknowledge that there are rarely easy answers.
So there you have it. The life and death of Stanley Tookie Williams, a story as compelling as it is controversial. We hope this deep dive has given you some new perspectives and maybe even sparked a few questions of your own.
And if you're interested in learning more, there's a wealth of information out there. Books, documentaries, articles. We encourage you to keep exploring, keep digging, keep diving deep.
Because that's what the deep dive is all about, you know? Equipping you with the knowledge and insights to engage with the world around you in a meaningful way.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep the conversation going.
All right, so get this. Today we're diving into a true crime story that might remind you of, well, the Hardy Boys, but instead of solving mysteries, this duo from New Orleans, they were making headlines for all the wrong reasons, really.
Oh, yeah.
We're taking that Wikipedia article you send over, and we're going to really dissect their rise and fall. And trust me, it's a wild ride.
It's a fascinating case, really,
Yeah.
especially when you consider the backdrop. The late 80s and early 90s, when so many American cities were dealing with just a surge in drug-related violence. The Hardy Boys, Wayne and Paul, cool Hardy, really capture that dark side of that era.
Yeah, they weren't exactly out there solving mysteries, more like creating them. So to understand how these guys operate, we need to go beyond just names and dates, right? What made them tick?
Well, I think their organization is a classic example of what we call racketeering. But it's more than just a fancy word. These guys were running a full-blown criminal enterprise.
Right.
We're talking extortion, money laundering, and a whole lot of violence just to maintain their grip on power.
So not your typical family business, huh? And it sounds like they weren't afraid to make a statement right from the start. Their first big headline grabber was the murder of Jerome Andrews in 1988. And it wasn't exactly subtle. We're talking a drive-by shooting.
Yeah, that's right. And then, if that wasn't bold enough, just a year later, in 1989, they orchestrate a whole shooting spree at the Florida projects that left one person, Michael Handy, dead, and 4 others wounded. It's actually chilling to think about. They were even shot at again as they were being wheeled into the hospital.
Wow, that's intense. It really sounds like they were sending a message, and a pretty brutal one. But here's the crazy part. They were acquitted of these charges, so was this just a case of them getting lucky?
Well, it might be more than just luck. The justice system at that time, it faced numerous challenges, and securing convictions in cases that involved gangs was incredibly difficult. Witnesses were often just too scared to testify. Evidence was hard to come by. And there were even instances of, corruption within law enforcement itself.
So a system struggling to keep up with all this violence, and the Hardy Boys took full advantage. But they weren't just, like, thugs with guns, right? Their business, it had layers.
Oh, absolutely. To really understand their power,
Yeah.
you have to look at their drug operation. They were heavily involved in heroin distribution. It wasn't just street-level dealing either. They had a sophisticated network for moving large quantities of drugs. And they were ruthless about protecting their turf.
And just to make sure everyone knew they weren't messing around, like the 1990 robbery at the Skate City roller rink, where they snatched earrings, talk about brazen. And then the murder of Ulcie White in 1992, a case that still remains unsolved to this day. Were these just random acts or part of a larger strategy?
It's hard to say for certain. What is clear, though, is that the Hardy Boys were operating in a world where violence was just a tool for control, for sending a message, and for eliminating rivals. But the incident with Joe Straughter, it allegedly involved their own brother, Lionel, over some money owed, shows that even within their own circle, things weren't exactly harmonious.
So even family, it was all about business. But things really started heating up in 1994. A turf war erupts in the Florida projects. And Paul Hardy, it seems like he goes on a personal mission to eliminate the competition.
Yeah, this wasn't just a rivalry. This was a battle for control, for dominance, really, in a very lucrative market. And Paul Hardy, he showed just how ruthless he was willing to be. First, it was Corey Richardson, allegedly murdered to keep him quiet. Then it was Carlos Adams, shot multiple times.
And it just escalates from there. Sean King and Troy Watts' ambush, they weren't shy about using some serious firepower either. I mean, assault weapons were part of their arsenal. What fueled this sudden increase in violence?
Oh, turf wars were common, especially during the crack epidemic. These conflicts often stemmed from competition over drug distribution territories, but they were also exacerbated by just the influx of weapons. and the culture of fear that was really permeating those communities.
So a complex mix of factors driving this deadly spiral. But then, to make things even more complicated, we have the entrance of Len Davis, a New Orleans police officer nicknamed the Desire Terrorist. And this is where things get really interesting. How does a cop end up entangled with guys like the Hardy Boys?
Well, this is where the story takes a turn
Okay.
towards institutional corruption. Davis wasn't just turning a blind eye. He was actively aiding the Hardy Boys, feeding them information, providing protection, in exchange for, well, who knows what.
Talk about a betrayal of the badge. They
Wow.
basically had an inside man, making their operation even more difficult to penetrate. And sadly, this corrupt relationship, it had deadly consequences.
Yeah, it's a chilling thought. A police officer not only condoning this level of violence, but enabling it. And it all culminates in the tragic murder of Kim Groves. It seems like she was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, right? Well, sadly, Kim Groves was targeted. You see, she had filed a brutality complaint against Len Davis. And he, fearing the consequences, used his connection with Paul Hardy to silence her permanently. It was a cold, calculated act of retaliation.
So this wasn't just a random act of violence. This was a deliberate attempt to eliminate a threat. What really stands out to me is the level of premeditation involved. Davis didn't just snap, he planned this out.
Yeah, it's a textbook example of how corruption can just erode the very foundation of justice.
Yeah.
A police officer who's sworn to protect the public becomes a predator, using his position to eliminate anyone who dares to challenge him. It's terrifying, really.
It really does shed a dark light on the power dynamics at play here. But the Hardy Boys couldn't outrun the law forever. Their reign of terror had to come to an end eventually, right?
It did, and ironically, it was their connection to Len Davis that ultimately led to their downfall. The murder of Kim Groves became their undoing. In December 1994, Paul Hardy, along with his accomplice Damon Causey and Len Davis, were all arrested for her murder.
I bet that was a major turning point for authorities. Taking down a dirty cop, especially one as deeply embedded as Davis. It must have been a huge win.
It was a pivotal moment, for sure. The investigation into Davis's activities just opened up a Pandora's box. He wasn't just involved in this one murder. He was implicated in ordering at least 13 killings. It was a systematic elimination of witnesses who dared to speak out against him.
13 killings. It's hard to fathom the depth of his corruption. What were the repercussions for the New Orleans Police Department? This had to shake things up.
Absolutely. Davis's arrest sent shockwaves through the entire department. The FBI launched Operation Shattered Shield, which was a full-scale investigation into corruption within the ranks. Several officers connected to Davis were suspended, and the whole department was just forced to confront this systemic rot that had taken hold.
So a reckoning of sorts for the New Orleans Police Department, a forced confrontation with its own dark side. What was the ultimate outcome for Paul Hardy and Len Davis? Did they face justice for their actions?
They did. Both were convicted for the murder of Kim Groves, and they received life sentences. A fitting punishment considering the gravity of their crimes.
Life sentences. A small measure of justice, I guess, for the lives they destroyed. But what about Wayne? He was a key part of the Hardy Boys operation. What happened to him?
Well, Wayne's ending is shrouded in mystery. In 1996, just 2 years after his brother's arrest, he was found shot to death in a car, along with a woman, on S. Carrollton and Tillian Avenue.
That's an unsettling end. Was his death ever connected back to his past? To the Hardy Boys' criminal enterprise? Or was it just a tragic coincidence?
That's the big question that lingers. The circumstances surrounding his death, they remain unclear. Was it a settling of old scores, retaliation for past deeds, or was he just caught in a completely unrelated act of violence? We're left to speculate.
It adds another layer of intrigue to this already fascinating story. But beyond the crimes, beyond the violence, what does this whole saga tell us about the broader context? The Hardy Boys, they didn't operate in a vacuum, did they?
Right. Their story goes beyond just these individuals. It exposes the vulnerabilities of a system that's grappling with poverty, inequality, and a lack of opportunity. And it highlights how those factors create a breeding ground for crime and corruption to flourish.
So it's not just about the Hardy Boys themselves, but about the environment that allowed them to thrive. They were both products and exploiters of that vulnerability, weren't they?
Absolutely. Their rise was facilitated by a system that often failed its most vulnerable citizens, leaving them susceptible to the allure of easy money and the sense of belonging that gangs can provide.
It's like their story is a microcosm of the larger societal struggles happening in New Orleans at the time. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one key takeaway you hope our listeners walk away with?
I think the most important takeaway is that this story, as horrific as it is, has valuable lessons for us today. The fight for justice, for equality, and for accountability. It's an ongoing battle. It requires us to be vigilant, to think critically, and to challenge the status quo.
It's easy to get caught up in the true crime aspect of it all, but we have to remember that these are real lives, real communities, forever impacted by these events.
Exactly. And by understanding the forces that shape these stories, we become more informed citizens, better equipped to advocate for positive change.
So it's not just about learning from the past, but using that knowledge to build a better future.
Precisely. The Hardy Boys saga is a cautionary tale, a reminder that we all have a responsibility to engage with the issues that matter, to speak truth to power, and to work towards a more just and equitable society.
That's a powerful message. So, to our listener, I hope this deep dive into the Hardy Boys story has sparked your curiosity. There's so much more to explore, whether it's the history of New Orleans, the impact of the drug war, or the fight against police corruption. Keep asking questions, keep challenging assumptions, and never underestimate the power of your own voice. It really makes you think, doesn't it? How many other Hardy Boys are out there, trapped in these cycles? But I'm curious, this all happened in New Orleans, a city known for its vibrant culture, its history. Do you think the city itself played a role in how this all unfolded?
It's an interesting point. New Orleans, it has a unique history, a unique culture, but it's also a city marked by these social and economic disparities. And we can't forget the impact of Hurricane Katrina, which really amplified many of these issues. It's like the city itself embodies this struggle between resilience and vulnerability.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Maybe those same forces were at play in the lives of the Hardy Boys, too. They were both products and exploiters of that vulnerability, right?
Absolutely. Their rise, it's facilitated by a system that often failed its most vulnerable citizens, leaving them susceptible to, the allure of easy money and that sense of belonging that gangs can provide.
It's like their story is a microcosm of the larger struggles happening in New Orleans at that time. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one key takeaway you hope our listeners walk away with?
That's a good question. I think the most important takeaway is that this story, as horrific as it is, it has some valuable lessons for us today. The fight for justice, for equality, for accountability, it's an ongoing battle. It requires us to be vigilant, to think critically, and to always be challenging the status quo.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the true crime aspect of it all, but we have to remember these are real lives, real communities forever impacted by these events.
Exactly. And by understanding the forces that shape these stories, we become more informed citizens, better equipped to advocate for positive change.
So it's not just about learning from the past, it's about using that knowledge to build a better future.
Precisely. The Hardy Boys saga, it's a cautionary tale. It's a reminder that we all have a responsibility to engage with the issues that matter, to speak truth to power, and to work towards a more just and equitable society for everyone.
That's a powerful message. So to our listener out there, I hope this deep dive into the Hardy Boys story has sparked your curiosity. There's so much more to explore here, whether it's the history of New Orleans, the impact of the drug war, or the fight against police corruption. Keep asking questions, keep challenging assumptions, and never underestimate the power of your own voice. That's all for this deep dive. All right, so we're going to take a deep dive into the life of Claude Massop.
Yeah.
A name that you've probably never heard of, but
Right.
stick with us on this one because it's a pretty wild ride.
Absolutely.
We're going off of his Wikipedia entry here.
Yeah.
And it's really a doorway to understanding this really fascinating period of Jamaican history that's just full of contradictions.
Yeah, it's an incredible life story and one that really encapsulates the kind of like turmoil that was going on in Jamaica in the 60s and 70s.
Absolutely. So we start out in Denhamtown, West Kingston, 1947. Not exactly a place known for, silver spoons or anything like that.
No, definitely not.
Right.
Poverty was rampant.
Yeah.
Opportunities were incredibly scarce.
Yeah.
It was an environment that could definitely push someone towards a life on the edge.
Yeah, and that's what happens, right?
Yeah.
The entry talks about him being a street hustler, even a pimp.
Mhm.
I mean, pretty rough stuff, right? But then there's this interesting detail.
Yeah.
He becomes a chief contractor in construction.
Right.
What do you make of that shift?
That's one of the things I find so fascinating about Claude Massop is that even in these early days amidst the,
Right.
the crime and the rough stuff,
Yeah.
there's a hint of leadership. There's a hint of organizational skill.
Yeah.
He's clearly got a mind for taking charge,
Yeah.
for building something.
Yeah.
And it's almost foreshadowing of what's to come.
Okay, hold on. You're talking about his leadership in the shower posse, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
So by 18, he's already a leader in this group.
Wow.
And just to give a little context for our listener,
Yeah.
the shower posse, eventually becomes this notorious gang in Jamaica,
Right.
led by Lester Lloyd Coke,
Yeah.
or better known as Jim Brown.
Right.
Their reach extended deep into the drug trade.
Mm-hmm.
They were known for their ruthlessness.
So we're talking about, Massop, even as a young man,
Yeah.
is already entangled with some seriously heavy hitters.
Absolutely, and his influence is only growing.
Yeah.
By 1967, he's a major player in Tivoli Gardens.
Oh.
Now, Tivoli Gardens was initially intended as this new housing development,
Yeah.
meant to offer better living conditions for people.
It's a far cry from the gang stronghold it became, though.
Right.
How did that happen?
Well, it's a complex story.
Right.
But you essentially had a community that was struggling with poverty, a lack of resources,
Yeah.
and there was political instability.
Right.
And it basically created this breeding ground for violence
Right.
and criminal activity.
Yeah.
And those who could wield power.
Right.
Like Claude Massop rose to the top.
So Tivoli Gardens becomes this sort of microcosm of Jamaica's struggles at the time.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And Massop's story is really intertwined with that transformation.
Yeah.
And he wasn't alone, of course.
Right.
There were other powerful figures, other rivals vying for control.
Right.
You had George Feathermop Spence, Winston Bury Boy Blake,
Oh, wow.
and Tony Welch operating out of the nearby Arnett Gardens, also known as Jungle.
Okay, so we've got multiple gangs all clashing
Yeah.
for territory and influence.
Right.
I mean, that sounds like a recipe for chaos.
It was a very volatile time. And to make matters worse, or I guess more complicated, I should say, the lines between gang activity and politics,
Right.
they were so blurry.
Yeah.
The Wikipedia entry actually mentions that Blake and Spence's motorcycle gang
Okay.
acted as enforcers for the then housing minister, Anthony Spaulding.
No way.
Yeah.
So you've got these gangs basically acting as muscle for the government?
It speaks to the level of corruption
Yeah.
and the way that power operated in Jamaica.
That's insane.
Yeah.
This is getting really heavy here.
Right.
And Massop's right in the thick of it.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the thing. He had a string of arrests, right?
He did.
I mean, murder, armed robbery, you name it.
Yep.
But somehow he never gets convicted.
Yeah.
How is that possible?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
The entry doesn't get into the specifics, but it does paint this picture of a man who seemed to operate above the law.
Yeah.
Whether it was through influence or intimidation or sheer luck,
Right.
he managed to avoid any serious consequences.
It's almost like he's got this Teflon coating.
Right.
Nothing sticks to him.
Exactly. And that just adds to the mystique
Yeah.
and the power that he held.
For sure. But then we come to this almost unbelievable turn of events.
Yeah.
January 1978.
Mm.
Jamaica's on the verge of imploding with political violence.
Mm.
Hundreds of people have already died.
Right.
And then a truce.
A truce orchestrated in part by Claude Massop.
Yeah.
It really makes you question everything we thought we knew about him, right?
It does.
Was this genuine desire for peace
Yeah.
or a strategic move?
Right.
The Wikipedia entry doesn't offer easy answers,
Right.
but it does mention that he wasn't alone in this effort.
Okay.
He worked alongside Carl Baya Mitchell,
Yeah.
his lieutenant in the shower posse,
Yeah.
and Aston Bucky Marshall Thompson, who was actually aligned with the opposing political party, the PNP.
Wow. So we've got a notoriously violent gang leader
Right.
and someone from the opposing political faction
Yep.
all coming together to broker peace. How did that even work?
It's a testament to Massop's ability to really navigate these complex situations, build
Yeah.
alliances, and perhaps a recognition that this escalating violence
Yeah.
was detrimental to everyone, even those in power.
It makes you wonder if he saw this truce as a chance to change his image.
Right.
Maybe even legitimize his influence in a new way.
It's certainly a possibility.
Yeah.
But whatever his motivations,
Yeah.
the truce did have a significant impact on Jamaica.
Yeah.
It brought a period of relative calm after years of this intense political violence.
The entry mentions over 800 deaths in the lead up to the 1980 elections.
Yeah.
That's just staggering.
It is.
To think that Massop played a role in stopping that bloodshed,
Right.
even temporarily, is pretty mind-blowing.
It really is.
Yeah.
It adds another layer to this complex, almost contradictory figure.
Absolutely.
A man capable of both extreme violence and seemingly genuine peacemaking efforts.
Okay, but this is where Massup's story takes a dark turn again, right?
Yes, unfortunately it does.
Okay.
Just over a year after brokering that truce, on February 4th, 1979, Claude Massop is dead shot by police.
Wait, what?
Yeah.
After everything he'd done, the truce, the influence he had, just gunned down like that?
The details are chilling.
Yeah.
He was leaving a football match in Spanish Town,
Okay.
a match involving the Tivoli Gardens Football Club.
Okay.
Newspaper reports at the time say there was a police car chase.
Okay.
And then Massop was shot at least 40 times.
Hold on, at least 40 times.
At least 40 times.
That's an execution.
And 2 other men were killed alongside him, Lloyd Fraser and Alphonse and Trevor Tinson.
Wow.
Again, the entry doesn't give us a lot of context for this incident.
That's insane after brokering a peace truce.
Right.
After everything he'd been through, this is how it ends. It almost feels like something out of a Greek tragedy, you know?
I see what you mean. There's a certain tragic element to it.
Yeah.
This man who seemingly rose above the law,
Right.
who escaped countless charges,
Yeah.
is ultimately killed by the very forces that he had navigated for so long.
It makes you wonder, was this a targeted hit?
Right.
Was it revenge for his past actions?
Yeah.
Or was he simply caught in the crossfire of Jamaica's ongoing violence?
Unfortunately, the Wikipedia entry doesn't delve into the specifics of the investigation,
Right.
if there even was one.
Yeah.
We're left with more questions than answers.
So we've gone from the poverty of Denham Town
Right.
to the heights of gang leadership and political influence.
Yeah.
A brief moment of peacemaking,
Mm,
and then this brutal, abrupt end.
that's a lot.
It's almost too much to process. Where do we even begin to make sense of a life like that?
That's the challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
Massop's story is a microcosm of Jamaica's history during this very tumultuous period. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power,
Right.
corruption, and the cycle of violence
Yeah.
that often traps those who try to escape it.
He was a product of his environment, but he also helped shape it.
Right.
He was a criminal, a leader, a peacemaker, and ultimately a victim.
Yeah.
It's hard to reconcile all of those things in one person.
And that's precisely why his story is so compelling,
Yeah.
so thought-provoking.
Yeah.
It challenges our easy categorizations of good and evil, of right and wrong.
Right.
Massop was all of those things, and perhaps none of them.
He was just Claude Massop, this man who lived and died
Huh.
by the rules of a world most of us will never understand.
Right.
And it's hard to imagine a life more full of contradictions
Yeah.
than Claude Massop's, but his story doesn't end with his death, does it?
No, it doesn't. And that's what makes his legacy so fascinating, is that even today, despite his, undeniable involvement in
Right.
criminal activities, some people in Jamaica view him as a folk hero.
That's wild.
Yeah.
What do you think contributes to that perception?
I think it's a reflection of the very deep-seated resentment towards systemic inequality
Yeah.
that still exists in Jamaica.
Right.
Massop, in a twisted way, represented a challenge to the established order. He
Yeah.
came from nothing,
Yeah.
clawed his way to power,
Right.
and even managed to broker peace, if only for a short time.
So for some people, he embodied this idea of fighting back against a system that had failed them,
Exactly.
even if his methods were far from heroic.
Right. It's a reminder that history is rarely black and white.
Right.
People are complex. Their actions can be driven by a mix of motivations,
Right.
some noble, some not.
It makes you think about how we judge figures from the past, especially those who operated in the shadows in a world of violence and corruption.
Yeah.
Do we condemn them outright,
Right.
or do we try to understand the context that
Yeah.
shaped their choices?
And Massop's story forces us to ask those tough questions, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It does. It's a reminder that even in the darkest corners of society,
Right.
There are glimmers of humanity, of complexity.
absolutely.
So taking a step back, what does Claude Massop's life and even his death tell us about Jamaica, both then and now?
I think it speaks to the enduring legacy of poverty,
Right.
inequality, and political corruption that continue to plague Jamaican society.
Yeah.
These are the same forces that shaped Massop's rise and ultimately contributed to his downfall.
It's a sobering reminder that even decades later, many of the issues Massop was entangled with are still very much present. The cycle of violence, the struggle for opportunity,
Right.
the blurred lines between those in power and those operating outside the law.
And that's why his story resonates even today. It's
Yeah.
a reflection of Jamaica's struggles, its
Yeah.
complexities, and its ongoing search for a better future.
This deep dive has been a journey, that's for sure.
Yeah, it has.
From the streets of Denhamtown to the heights of power and back down again.
Right. We've seen brutality, ambition, a fleeting moment of peace, and a tragic end.
But even though Claude Massoff's story is rooted in a very specific time and place,
Right.
it raises these really universal questions about power,
Yeah.
morality, and the choices we make when faced with these seemingly impossible circumstances.
So as we wrap up, I'm left with this one thought. What does Massoff's life tell us about the relationship between poverty, opportunity, and violence?
Yeah.
Not just in Jamaica, but anywhere in the world where these forces collide.
It's a question worth pondering.
It is.
How do individuals navigate these environments?
Yeah.
When do the lines between survival and ambition blur?
Right.
And what can we learn from those who, for better or worse, dared to challenge the status quo?
It's a lot to think about, that's for sure. And I hope this deep dive into Claude Massoff's life has given our listener a glimpse into a world they might have never known existed.
Right.
And sparked some curiosity to explore these themes further. Thanks for joining us on this journey.
Absolutely.
And until next time, keep diving deep.
Yeah. Yeah, it really makes you question everything you thought you knew about this guy, you know?
Right.
Was he just like a power-hungry gangster? Or did he have, you know, like some genuine desire for peace?
Yeah.
We don't know.
Yeah, and he wasn't alone in this, right?
No, he wasn't.
He worked alongside Bia Mitchell, his lieutenant in the Shower Posse,
Right.
and Aston Bucky Marshall Thompson,
Yeah.
who was actually aligned with the PNP.
Yeah, and that's important for the listener to know
Yeah.
that you've got these two dominant parties in Jamaica, the JLP,
Right.
which Massop and Mitchell were associated with, and
Right.
the PNP,
Right.
and the rivalry between these two
Yeah,
often spilled into violence,
especially during elections.
especially during elections, yes.
Yeah, so we've got this notoriously violent gang leader
Right.
and someone from the opposing political faction
Yeah.
all coming together to broker peace. I mean, how did that even work?
It speaks to Massop's, you know, ability to navigate
Right.
these really complex situations,
Yeah.
to build alliances,
Right.
and, you know, maybe even a recognition that this escalating violence was just bad for business for everyone.
Right. It makes you wonder if he saw this as a chance to, like, change his image.
Yeah.
Maybe even legitimize his influence in a new way.
Possibly.
Yeah.
But regardless of his motivations,
Yeah.
the truce did have a significant impact.
It did.
It brought a period of relative calm
Right.
to Jamaica after years of this really intense political violence.
Yeah, the entry mentions over 800 deaths in the lead up to the 1980 election.
Yeah. That's a staggering number.
That's just crazy.
Yeah,
To think that he played a role in stopping that,
Yeah.
even temporarily, is pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah, it is.
It adds another layer to this,
Yeah.
you know, already complex and contradictory figure.
Right. A man capable of both extreme violence
Right,
and, you know, seemingly genuine peacemaking.
right. But this is where his story takes another dark turn.
It does.
Yeah.
Just over a year after brokering this truce,
Okay.
on February 4th, 1979. Yeah. Claude Massop is dead.
What?
Shot by police.
Whoa, hold on.
Yeah.
After everything he'd done,
I know.
the truce, the influence he had,
Right.
just gunned down.
Yeah, the details are pretty chilling.
Yeah.
He was leaving a football match in Spanish Town,
Okay.
a match involving the Tivoli Gardens Football Club.
Okay.
Newspaper reports at the time said there was like a police car chase,
Okay.
and then Massop was shot
Yeah.
at least 40 times.
At least 40 times.
At least 40 times.
I mean, that's an execution.
Yeah, and two other men were killed alongside him, Lloyd Fraser and Alphonson Trevor Tinson.
Wow.
And again, the entry doesn't give us much context for this incident.
That's insane. So after brokering a peace truce, after everything he'd been through,
Yeah,
this is how it ends.
right. It almost feels like something out of like a Greek tragedy. You know, this man who seemingly rose above the law,
Right.
who
Yeah.
escaped countless charges,
Right.
is ultimately killed by the very forces that he had navigated for so long.
It makes you wonder, was this a targeted hit?
Right.
Was it revenge for his past actions?
Yeah.
Or was he just simply caught in the crossfire of Jamaica's ongoing violence?
Unfortunately, the Wikipedia entry doesn't, you know, go into the specifics of the investigation, if there
Right.
even was one.
Right.
So we're kind of left with more questions than answers.
So we've gone from the poverty of Denhamtown
Right.
to the heights of gang leadership and political influence.
Yeah.
A brief moment of peacemaking, and then this brutal, abrupt end.
It's a lot to process.
It is. It's almost too much to process.
Yeah.
I mean, where do we even begin to make sense of a life like that?
That's the challenge, isn't it?
It is.
Massop's story is, in a lot of ways, a microcosm
Right.
of Jamaica's history
Mm.
during this very tumultuous period.
Absolutely.
It forces us to confront these uncomfortable truths about power,
Right.
about corruption,
Right.
about the cycle of violence that often traps those who try to escape it.
Yeah, he was a product of his environment,
Mm.
but he also helped shape it.
Right.
He was a criminal,
Yeah.
a leader,
A peacemaker.
a peacemaker, and ultimately a victim.
Yeah, it's hard to reconcile all of those things in one person.
Right.
And that's precisely why his story is so compelling,
Yeah.
so thought-provoking.
Right.
It really challenges these easy categorizations we have
Right.
of good and evil or right and wrong.
Yeah.
Massop was all of those things and perhaps none of them.
He was just Claude Massop,
Yeah.
this man who lived and died
Mm.
by the rules of a world most of us will never understand.
Yeah, it's a wild story, right? But even though his life was cut short,
Yeah.
his story doesn't end with his death, does it?
No, it doesn't. And that's what's so fascinating about his legacy is that even today,
Yeah.
despite his involvement in all this criminal activity,
Right.
some people in Jamaica still view him as a folk hero.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
What do you think contributes to that?
Well, I think it's partly a reflection of the very deep-seated resentment.
Towards inequality and injustice
Hmm?
that still exists in Jamaica today.
Right.
Massop, in a way,
Mhm.
represented this challenge to the established order.
Right.
He came from nothing,
Right.
clawed his way to power,
Mm-hmm.
and even managed to bring about peace,
Yeah.
however briefly.
So for some people, he's a symbol of, fighting back against a system
Yeah.
that's failed them,
Exactly.
even if his methods were, definitely not always ethical or legal.
Right. It's a reminder that history is rarely black and white,
Right.
and people are complex.
Yeah.
Their actions can be driven by a whole mix of motivations.
Makes you think about how we judge figures from the past,
Yeah.
especially those who operated in the shadows.
Right. In a world of violence and corruption.
Do we just condemn them outright?
Yeah.
Or do we try to understand the forces that shaped their choices?
And I think Massop's story really forces us to grapple with those questions.
It does.
Because it reminds that even in the darkest corners of society, there's still those glimmers of humanity.
For sure. For sure. So taking a step back,
Yeah.
what does Massop's life and even his death
Yeah.
tell us about Jamaica both then and now?
Well, I think it speaks to the enduring legacy of poverty,
Mm-hmm.
inequality, and corruption that continue to affect Jamaica.
Yeah.
These are the forces that shaped Massop's rise and ultimately contributed to his downfall.
It's a sobering reminder that even decades later, a lot of these issues are still very much present.
Yeah.
The violence, the struggle for opportunity.
Yeah, the blurred lines between the powerful and the, those operating outside the law.
Right, right. And it's why his story still resonates today.
It's a reflection of Jamaica's ongoing struggles,
Yeah,
its complexities,
absolutely.
and its search for a better future.
This deep dive has been quite a journey.
It has.
From the streets of Denham Town to the heights of power and back down again. We've seen the brutality, the ambition, a fleeting moment of peace, and ultimately a very tragic end.
But even though Massop's story is rooted in this specific time and place,
Yeah,
I think it raises these universal questions about power,
absolutely.
morality,
Yeah.
and the choices we make when we're confronted with these impossible circumstances.
So as we wrap up here, I'm left with this thought.
Yeah.
What does Massop's life tell us about the relationship between poverty,
Mm-hmm.
opportunity, and violence, not just in Jamaica,
Right.
but anywhere in the world where these forces collide?
It's a question worth pondering.
It is. How do individuals navigate these really tough environments?
Right.
When do the lines between survival and ambition get blurred?
Yeah.
And what can we learn from those who, for better or worse, dared to challenge the status quo?
A lot to think about.
A lot to think about for sure, and I hope this deep dive into Claude Massop's life
Yeah.
has given you, our listener, a glimpse into a world that you might not have known existed, and maybe spark some curiosity to explore these themes further. Thanks for joining us on this journey.
Absolutely.
And until next time, keep diving. All right, so today we're going to take a deep dive into this case, United States versus Thomas Gambino. 1993.
Oh, yeah, this one's a fascinating one.
It's got all the classic elements you think of with the mob, right?
Right.
You've got a Gambino, so obviously organized crime is involved.
Of course it.
But there's a twist. Thomas Gambino was actually convicted alongside John Gotti.
The Teflon Don himself.
Exactly. But here's the thing. His co-defendant, Giuseppe Gambino, walks free. Acquitted.
Yeah, how do you get two Gambinos, same trial, two different verdicts? What happened?
That's exactly what I was thinking. That's what we're going to try to unpack today.
Yep.
So to help me break down all this, the legal complexities, the family dynamics, the whole 9 yards, I've got a real expert here.
Happy to be here.
So I think for starters, it'd be helpful to get a lay of the land. When we're talking about the Gambino family, what are we really talking about? What's the structure?
Sure. So at the top, you've got the boss. And in this case, it was the infamous John Gotti.
Mm-hmm.
And then right under him, you have the underboss that was Tommy Bellotti.
Okay, so Gotti's calling the shots. Bellotti's his right-hand man. What about our guy, Thomas Gambino? Where does he fit into all this?
So Thomas, he held the rank of captain.
Captain?
Now, a captain isn't just some low-level guy.
Yeah.
They oversee their own crew, their own operations. Pretty significant.
So he wasn't just some distant relative trying to cash in on the family name. He was a real player.
Yeah, a real player in the family business. And a big part of the prosecution's case was trying to link Thomas to specific crimes, specifically to the Connecticut faction of the Gambino family.
Okay, Connecticut. So they were branching out.
Oh, they were always branching out. Now, to prove this connection, they presented some pretty interesting evidence. They had recordings, conversations between John Gotti and other mobsters, guys like George Remini.
Wait, they had Gotti on tape.
Yeah, they did. And in these recordings, you actually hear Gotti talking about Thomas Gambino, mentioning him by name.
Wow, so he was like snitching on his own captain.
It's more complicated than that. But the recordings definitely implicate Thomas in some illegal activities. Gambling, loan sharking, even labor racketeering, all the way up in Connecticut.
Labor racketeering, like
Yeah.
strong-arming unions and
Yeah.
businesses.
Exactly. And Gotti even refers to Thomas as Skipper.
Skipper.
Yeah, that was apparently code for captain. So a nickname within the family.
So not exactly trying to hide their activities, were they?
I mean, maybe they thought they were being careful using code names, whatnot, but, the feds were listening.
Right. So we've got Gotti on tape, and he's talking about Skipper and some shady business happening up in Connecticut.
Right.
So how does Connecticut actually fit into all of this?
Well, that's where Tony McGowl comes in.
Mm-hmm.
He was basically Thomas's guy in Connecticut.
The point man.
Yeah, you could say that. He was running things up there, reporting back to Thomas.
Okay, so we've got this chain of command. You've got Gotti at the top, then Thomas, and then this Migla guy handling Connecticut.
Yeah, that's the picture the prosecution was trying to paint.
And did they have anything to back that up?
Oh, yeah. More than just those recordings. They also had evidence that Miguel was making all these phone calls to businesses tied to Thomas Gambino.
Okay, that makes sense.
But there's more. There were also calls made to Giuseppe Gambino's residence.
Giuseppe, the brother who was acquitted. Now that's where I start to get tripped up. If the informant didn't connect Giuseppe, and they're building a case against Thomas, why was Giuseppe even on trial?
That's the million-dollar question. While those phone records and his association with Thomas definitely raised eyebrows, Gravano, that's the mob informant, specifically said he didn't know anything about Giuseppe being involved in the crimes. And there wasn't that clear-cut, direct evidence linking him to the rackets in Connecticut.
So they thought they had something on him, but it wasn't as strong as their case against Thomas.
Especially with those recordings of Gotti. Those were pretty damning for Thomas.
It's wild, isn't it? You've got this family notorious for their involvement in organized crime. And then you have the boss caught on tape seemingly confirming it all.
Yeah. It's like something out of a movie.
So where do we go from here?
Well, before we get to those different verdicts, we need to talk about what happened with Tony McGale. He got arrested and indicted in Connecticut.
The guy running the Connecticut operation for Thomas?
Yep, him. And it gets even more interesting when we start talking about his plea deal and how both Thomas Gambino and D. John Gotti were involved in those discussions, according to Gravano, that is.
So they were trying to control the situation, even from behind bars.
It seems that way. They actually allowed Miguel to plead guilty at first.
Why would they do that? Wouldn't that put more heat on the family?
Well, I'm guessing they thought it was the best way to protect the higher-ups, to keep Gotti and Thomas out of the spotlight. But then things took a pretty dramatic turn.
Uh-oh. What happened?
Miguel actually tried to withdraw his guilty plea.
Wow. So what did that mean for the prosecution? Did it blow their case wide open?
It definitely complicated things. And Gravano's testimony about all of this, especially about a meeting he claimed to have had with Thomas Gambino concerning Miguel's plea, became absolutely crucial to the prosecution.
But if Miguel withdrew his plea, wouldn't that cast doubt on what really happened?
It certainly could.
Right.
It definitely raises questions about the accuracy of Gravano's account.
This is getting more and more tangled.
Oh, yeah. And we haven't even gotten to the best part yet.
Wait, there's more?
Oh, there's always more. Remember, the prosecution had more up their sleeve than just Gravano's testimony. They also had video surveillance footage placing both Thomas and Giuseppe at the Ravenite Social Club.
The Ravenite. Now we're talking. That's like Mob Central, right?
Right. But being seen at a social club, even one as infamous as the Ravenite, doesn't necessarily prove you're guilty of a crime.
So did they have anything directly linking them to the actual rackets in Connecticut?
Well, they had those phone records, remember?
Yeah.
The ones connecting Miguel to both brothers.
Right, right.
Plus, the prosecution brought in another informant. This one was FBI, and they'd actually infiltrated the Connecticut operation.
So they had someone on the inside who could confirm what was going on.
Exactly. This informant corroborated everything. The illegal gambling, the loan sharking, the whole 9 yards.
It sounds like they were building a pretty solid case against Thomas.
They were. But then we come back to that head-scratcher. The jury convicted Thomas.
Yep.
But Giuseppe, he walked. How do you explain that?
That's what makes this whole thing so fascinating, right? It's like you think you've got it all figured out, and then...
And then there's a twist.
Exactly. And it makes you realize just how complicated these cases can be.
They're never straightforward.
So how do we even begin to unpack those contrasting verdicts?
Well, I think we need to take a closer look at Salvatore Gravano, the mob informant. He's a key piece of this puzzle. And his testimony, well, it's not as clear-cut as you might think.
I mean, the guy admitted to, 19 murders? And now he's the star witness.
Yeah, it's a tough one, right? How much can you really trust a guy like that?
Especially when he's trying to cut a deal to save his own skin.
Exactly. So you can bet the defense had a field day with Gravano on the stand.
I bet they did. Did they manage to, poke any holes in his story?
Oh, they did. They went after his whole criminal history, brought up every last detail. They pointed out inconsistencies, contradictions in his different accounts, really tried to paint him as this unreliable narrator.
And this is where that whole timeline about Miguel's plea withdrawal gets messy, right?
That's right. Remember, Gravano said he'd met with Thomas Gambino to talk about the plea. Well, the defense actually had detailed FBI surveillance logs.
What? Like, they knew where Thomas was every minute of the day?
Pretty much. And guess what? Thomas was out of town on the date Gravano gave for that meeting.
So Gravano's timeline was off. He got caught.
He did. The prosecution tried to say, oh, he must have just misremembered the exact date.
But come on.
Right. But the damage was done. The jury had heard it. That seed of doubt about Gravano's credibility, well, it was planted.
So is that why the jury came back with those different verdicts? They didn't believe Gravano when it came to Giuseppe.
It's possible. Maybe they thought, okay, some of what Gravano said checks out, especially the parts that were backed up by other evidence. But when it came to Giuseppe...
They weren't buying it.
Maybe not. And remember, the defense hammered that point home.
You mean that even Gravano, someone supposedly in the inner circle, couldn't tie Giuseppe to anything concrete?
That's exactly what they argued. And it seems like that might have resonated with the jury.
It's incredible how much power a single witness can have in a trial like this.
Especially when you're dealing with organized crime, where loyalty and silence are everything.
So if we step back from Gravano for a second, what other factors might have influenced those different verdicts?
Well, you have to consider the nature of the evidence itself, right? With Thomas, you had direct evidence, like Gotti's own words on those recordings, specifically naming him.
But with Giuseppe, it was more about connections and associations.
Right. Phone records, sightings at the Ravenite, that kind of thing.
So maybe the jury felt like, okay, there's enough to convict Thomas, but not enough to meet that, burden of proof for Giuseppe.
That's a very real possibility. And you can't forget the impact of those recordings. Hearing Gotti, the boss, actually implicate one of his own captains.
That's got to be pretty convincing.
It's not something you see every day. It really gave the prosecution a powerful weapon.
It makes you wonder what Gotti was thinking. Did he not realize he was incriminating his own guy?
Who knows? Maybe he felt so untouchable. Or maybe, with the feds cracking down, the pressure was getting to him.
It was a different time back then, wasn't it?
Definitely. The FBI was getting more aggressive, using wiretaps, cultivating informants. The walls were closing in, even for someone like Gotti.
This whole case, it's like a glimpse into a hidden world.
It is. And those contrasting verdicts, I think they tell us something important about the challenges of prosecuting organized crime.
What do you mean?
Well, these cases are rarely open and shut. You've got circumstantial evidence, unreliable witnesses, and proving intent, especially in a hierarchy like the Gambino family.
It's got to be tough.
Extremely tough.
Mm.
It's like peeling back layers of an onion. You've got the street-level stuff, the middlemen, and then these bosses at the top.
All insulated and protected.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And to really make a case, you need a deep understanding of how these organizations work, their codes, their structures, their methods.
And I imagine it puts a lot of pressure on the jury.
Oh, absolutely. They have to sift through all this information, weigh the credibility of these witnesses.
And ultimately decide the fate of people connected to a powerful and dangerous criminal organization.
It's a heavy burden that, beyond a reasonable doubt standard, is a high bar to clear.
And when it comes to Giuseppe's acquittal, it kind of makes you think, just because someone hangs out with known criminals, even family,
Right.
it doesn't automatically make them guilty.
Absolutely. That's a cornerstone of our legal system. You have to prove a clear link between the defendant and the specific crimes, not just guilt by association.
And in Giuseppe's case, that link seems to have been missing.
At least in the eyes of the jury. And that speaks to the importance of due process. Everyone deserves a fair trial, even if their last name is Gambino.
It's fascinating, isn't it? This whole deep dive has been like an education in organized crime.
It has.
We've got family dynamics, codes of silence, wiretaps, informants.
The whole shebang.
But it also makes you realize just how difficult it is for law enforcement to really break these networks.
It's a constant struggle. And as law enforcement develops new techniques, organized crime adapts.
It makes you wonder, what's next? Will we see a comeback of the traditional mafia families, or will they just become even more sophisticated?
That's a good question. Maybe one for another deep dive.
Yeah, something to think about. But one thing's for sure, organized crime isn't going away anytime soon.
Not a chance. It's a persistent threat. And it demands vigilance, innovation from law enforcement if they want to stay ahead of the curve.
And that brings us right back to the Gambino case.
Still circle.
It reminds us that there are always more layers to uncover, more questions to ask when it comes to organized crime. So what about you? What stands out to you about all this? What's been, surprising or thought-provoking aspect of this case? It's like you said earlier, you get caught up in the twists and turns of the trial, the personalities involved. But for me, it's the bigger picture that's really sticking with me. What does this case, this whole Gambino saga, tell us about the fight against organized crime as a whole?
Yeah, that's the real takeaway here, isn't it? I think the Gambino trial, it gives us a few valuable insights. Like, it shows just how hard it is to actually build a solid case against these organizations. I mean, they're built on secrecy, loyalty, intimidation. It's not like you can just walk up and ask for witnesses.
Right. It's not like they're going to be lining up to testify. And even when you do get someone like Gravano, an insider, there's always that question of, well, how much can we really believe?
Exactly. Juries are going to be skeptical, and they should be. You got a guy who admits to, 19 murders, and now he's the star witness for the government. There's always going to be that suspicion that maybe he's just saying what he needs to say to save himself.
Yeah, you can't just take his word as gospel.
No. Not at all. You have to corroborate, check timelines, examine every detail. And even then, there's a risk that the jury's just not going to buy it.
The Gambino case, with that focus on Connecticut, it also reminds us that this isn't just a big city problem anymore, is it? Organized crime, it's everywhere.
Oh, absolutely. They've infiltrated legitimate businesses, found new ways to make money. We're not just talking about the old school stuff like gambling and loan sharking anymore.
Right. It's so much bigger than that now.
Drugs, human smuggling, cybercrime, money laundering. It's a global operation these days. And that makes it even harder to track, to prosecute.
So how do you even begin to tackle something that big, that complex?
You need a multi-pronged approach, for sure. You've got your traditional methods, surveillance, wiretaps, undercover work. But you also have to keep up with the times. Use technology to track the money, monitor what's happening online, gather intelligence from all over the world.
And it's not enough to just catch the small timers anymore. You have to go after the whole structure.
You got to dismantle it from the top down.
Oh, yeah.
Target the bosses, the ones calling the shots, making the real money.
That's got to be so difficult. These guys are insulated, protected. They don't get their hands dirty.
Right, proving their involvement, connecting them to specific crimes, it takes a huge amount of effort, resources. But it's essential if you want to make a real impact.
Do you think people really understand how big this problem is? Like the extent of organized crime's influence?
I think there's a tendency to see it as this like romanticized thing,
Yeah.
like something out of a movie with tough guys and codes of honor. But the reality is much darker than that.
Yeah, it's not glamorous.
No, it's brutal. It's about exploiting people, preying on the vulnerable, undermining the rule of law. It's like a cancer, really.
It spreads and corrupts everything it touches, and it operates in the shadows so often you don't even know it's there until it's too late.
Exactly. That's why cases like this Gambino trial are so important. They bring these hidden networks into the light, show the public how they work, and remind us that this is a fight that never really ends.
It's a constant battle.
It is. And it's going to take collaboration, information sharing, new strategies, and a lot of hard work to stay ahead of the game.
It's not just up to law enforcement either. The public needs to be aware, know the signs, and speak up if they see something suspicious.
Absolutely. Silence and apathy, that's what lets organized crime thrive.
Well, I think it's safe to say we've covered a lot of ground today. This deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me.
Me too.
We've seen how complex organized crime is, the difficulties of bringing these guys to justice, and the need for constant vigilance.
And, even with a verdict, sometimes there's not a clear sense of closure.
Right, it's not always black and white. The Gambino case is a perfect example of that. So as we wrap things up, I'm curious what's resonating with you the most. What are you taking away from all of this?
That's a good question.
Maybe it's the power of a single witness to sway a jury, or just the fact that organized crime is still a major threat. Whatever it is, we hope this deep dive has given you something to think about.
Definitely.
And maybe it's even sparked your curiosity to learn more, to keep asking questions, to keep digging deeper. That's what we're all about here. So until next time.
Keep exploring.
That's right. Keep exploring. All right, everyone get ready. Today, we're going to dive deep into the life of Ah Toy. You might not know the name right away, but stick with us. Her story is incredible, especially during the California Gold Rush.
Yeah, she's like a perfect way to understand that whole time period.
Exactly. So to do this, we've got some excerpts from her Wikipedia page. And just for some background, a little info on the Gold Rush. What we're going to do is uncover how Ah Toy, who was a Chinese immigrant, became so powerful in San Francisco, ambitious, resilient, and navigating a system that was, well, not very welcoming, to say the least.
And to really get it, the context, we got to remember that before 1851, there were only 7 Chinese women documented in San Francisco.
Wow, just 7. Can you imagine? One of just a tiny handful of women in this city just exploding with people trying to get rich during the gold rush.
It's pretty amazing. And Ah Toy, she totally saw the opportunity there. She got known for these peep shows, charging a whole ounce of gold, which, was like $16 back then, just to look. Think about it. $16 then was a lot of money.
Yeah, that's wild. No wonder she became one of the wealthiest women in the city. But, she was clearly thinking bigger than just peep shows.
Oh, yeah. She was a total businesswoman. She built this whole chain of brothels, even bringing women over from China to work in them. And, of course, this is where things get a little complicated, I guess. Some of these women were really young, which brings up some ethical questions. You can't just ignore that.
For sure, it really shows how much exploitation was mixed in with all the opportunities back then. And it's interesting, too, she got pushback from some of the male Chinese leaders who wanted to control that whole industry. Seems like she was shaking things up, even within her own community.
Absolutely she was. You've got to picture her navigating this world, dominated by men, constantly asserting her position. And she even used the legal system a lot to her advantage, going to court to protect her business, For example, there was this one case. She sued this guy named Yi Ah Tai. He was trying to extort money from her. And she won, which shows how well she understood the legal system and how willing she was to stand up for her rights.
Wow, she knew the system, and she wasn't afraid to use it. But there's a big twist in this legal story, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. In 1854, there's this legal case, People v. Hall. It changed everything for her. Basically, the ruling said Chinese people couldn't testify in court, which left Ah Toy super vulnerable. She could get cheated or taken advantage of, and there wasn't much she could do legally.
So even though she was so good at using the legal system, the rules changed on her, and it became almost impossible to defend herself.
Exactly. And then, to make matters worse, an anti-prostitution law passed that same year, 1854. And guess what? It was mainly enforced against Chinese women. So Autoy was facing discrimination on, like, every side.
It's hard to imagine being in that situation. I wonder what she did next.
Well, instead of giving up, she decided to leave San Francisco in 1857. And it's important to note this. She left as a wealthy woman, went back to China with the plan to live comfortably.
Yeah, it sounds like she left on her own terms, but wait, if I remember correctly, she was back in California by 1859.
That's right, she was. Which makes you think, her ties to California must have been stronger than we think. And get this, from 1868 until she died in 1928, she lived a pretty quiet life in Santa Clara County.
Quiet, but probably not uneventful, especially given how things were back then.
Right, you got it. We don't know all the details. But she had several long-term partners during those years, but she couldn't legally marry any of them if they were white because of California's anti-miscegenation laws. Just imagine that.
Look,
Living in a society that wouldn't let you marry someone just because of their race.
it's really heartbreaking, and it shows all the limitations she faced, even while she was finding love and connection.
It's these kind of complex stories, interwoven with these bigger historical narratives that make Toy's journey so fascinating.
I agree. These deep dives help us discover those human sides of history, the parts you don't always get in textbooks.
Yeah, I think that's what people love about these stories, that chance to connect with history on a personal level, to see the struggles and the triumphs of people who lived through these incredible times.
Speaking of connecting, Toy's story is even part of popular culture.
You're right. She's in that Cinemax series Warrior. It takes place during the Tong Wars. In late 19th century San Francisco, there were these violent clashes between different Chinese secret societies. And the show portrays her as this really powerful figure navigating that whole world.
Oh, wow. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm definitely adding it to my list. It's so great to see these figures from history, especially someone like Toy get recognized like that.
Yeah, it shows her lasting impact, even if her name isn't as well known as some others from that time.
So before we move on to the next chapter in Toy's story, I got to ask you something. What do you think she would have wanted people to remember about her if she could have told her own story? What parts of her life, her struggles, her achievements, do you think she would have focused on?
That's a really good question. It makes you think about how stories get told and whose voices get heard.
Yeah, and it shows the work that historians do to piece together these hidden stories and give a voice to people who are often ignored or marginalized.
Exactly. It reminds us that history is always changing as we uncover new perspectives and challenge the stories that have always been told.
And that's what makes it so captivating, right? There's always more to discover, more stories to uncover, more layers to peel back.
I totally agree. It's a never-ending journey of discovery. But for now, we'll leave you with that question about how Toy would have told her own story. And we'll continue this amazing conversation in the next part of our deep dive.
It's amazing to think about how much Toy accomplished. I mean, starting with so little, and then, boom, she's a major figure in San Francisco just a few years later. It really makes you think about, what drove her,
Yeah, it's tough to know for sure, but it was probably a bunch of things. I mean, you read these historical accounts, and they make her sound so smart, so resourceful, like someone who really understood how power works and used it to her advantage. But we can't forget the limitations she faced, too, right? Being a Chinese woman during that era, it wasn't exactly easy.
Right. Even with money and influence, the whole system was kind of set up to hold her back. Her story is really a powerful example of, never giving up, even when things are stacked against you. And it's not just about her own success either, right? She was a pioneer for other Chinese women, too.
Absolutely. She was one of the first to really make a mark on San Francisco's history. And that's especially amazing when you consider how few opportunities Chinese women had at that time.
Her decision to go back to China in 1857, that's so interesting to me. What do we know about why she did that? Was it a sense of, accomplishment, or was it something totally different?
Yeah, that's a good question. Sadly, the historical records are a bit thin on the details of why she went back. We know she was financially secure when she left, which suggests she felt like she'd reached a point where she could make that choice.
It's fascinating to imagine what that was like for her, going back to China after everything she experienced in Gold Rush San Francisco. That must have been such a huge cultural shift.
Oh, definitely. Going from that kind of wild, fast-paced world back to a more traditional society, it must have been a huge adjustment. It makes you wonder how she felt about those two worlds, right? Did she feel like she belonged in either place, or was she kind of always stuck between two cultures?
That feeling of being caught between two cultures, that's something you see in so many immigrant stories. It's a pretty universal experience no matter when or where you come from.
Totally. And it gets to the heart of questions about identity. Like, how do you define yourself when you're always moving between different worlds, expectations, and values?
That's probably something Atoy wrestled with her whole life. And then, of course, there's the fact that she came back to California just a couple years later. Why do you think she came back?
It's something historians have been trying to figure out for a long time. Some think she might have missed the energy and opportunity that California offered, even with all the discrimination. Others think maybe she had unfinished business, personal connections she couldn't leave behind.
Maybe she felt a sense of freedom in California that she didn't have in China. It's easy to forget that back then, women in a lot of parts of the world didn't have many rights or opportunities. California, even with all its problems, might have given her more personal freedom than she could find anywhere else.
That's a great point. It's possible that California, even with all its prejudice, allowed her a level of independence and self-determination that was unavailable to her elsewhere.
And you have to remember, California was still a pretty young state back then, full of potential and change. I can see how she would be drawn back to that kind of dynamic energy.
Yeah, like she was always looking for new frontiers, both geographically and personally.
It makes you wonder what she thought about all the changes happening in California during that second stay. Imagine seeing all those cities growing so fast, all those new immigrants arriving, the whole political landscape shifting.
It must have been mind-blowing to see all that happening. She was there for the gold rush, which completely transformed California from this sleepy territory to a booming state. And then she came back to see it keep changing at an incredible pace.
And through it all, she's living this seemingly quiet life in Santa Clara County, away from all the craziness, but definitely shaped by it.
Right, like she's observing everything from a distance, processing all those huge changes happening around her. She had a front row seat to some of the most important moments in California's history.
It reminds me of that saying, the quieter you become, the more you can hear. Maybe those quieter years gave her time to really think about her experiences and find her place in a world that was changing so fast.
That's a beautiful way to put it. Maybe that's why her story still speaks to us today. It reminds us that even in these big historical moments, there are always these individual journeys happening in the background, full of their own unique depth and complexity.
And sometimes it's those quiet stories, the ones whispered on the sidelines, that hold the most profound truths. It's kind of interesting how Atoy just stepped back from the spotlight later in life. After all those years being this prominent figure, she chose this quiet existence.
Yeah, maybe it was her way of taking back some control,
Yeah.
defining her own story after so long of having it shaped by everyone else and what society thought she should be.
But even as she sought out that quieter life, those societal pressures, they were still there. Remember, she couldn't legally marry any of her partners if they were white because of those anti-miscegenation laws.
Yeah.
It's a harsh reminder of the racism that was just built into American society back then.
It really makes you think. Here she was, this woman who had overcome so much, achieved financial independence, and defied expectations, but she was denied this basic right just because of her race.
It really does. It makes you think about how those laws must have affected her relationships, her sense of belonging, her ability to freely express her love. It's easy to forget those laws weren't just words on paper. They actually controlled people's lives, dictating their choices and limiting their options.
Absolutely. Toy Story is a testament to that. She lived life on her own terms, carving out a space for herself in a world that was constantly trying to put her in a box.
A survivor, a businesswoman, a pioneer. Her story reminds us that history isn't just about dates and events, it's about people, real people navigating these complex and, let's be honest, often unjust systems.
And Toy Story reminds us that even when you're up against seemingly impossible obstacles, you can still persevere.
And even though she passed away in 1928, her legacy continues to inspire. She shows us how important it is to challenge the status quo and fight for a fairer world.
Yeah. Her story also highlights the fact that history is full of these unsung heroes. People who may not have made the headlines, but whose lives were still incredible.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into Atoy's fascinating life, let's take a second to appreciate her contributions, her struggles, and her triumphs. Let her story be a reminder that even when facing huge challenges, the human spirit is powerful.
And who knows, maybe somewhere out there, there's a collection of Atoy's personal writings just waiting to be found. Imagine what we could learn from her firsthand account.
Until then, we'll keep putting the pieces of her story together using what we have, honoring her legacy and making sure her name is not forgotten.
And hopefully, this deep dive inspires you all to keep exploring, uncover those hidden stories that are just waiting to be told.
That's what the deep dive is all about. exploring the fascinating, often overlooked parts of history and making those stories come to life. Because after all, history is happening all around us, every single day. Go out there and make some history of your